Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
Good morning. Today's class is on cover crops for your vegetable garden. My name is Thomas Bowles. I'm the Extension Agent here in Prince William County. We'll be talking about cover crops primarily for this coming fall winter. And again, if you've got questions, please make sure you put those in the chat box and we'll be able to get to those at the end. So as a reminder for those of you who don't know, Virginia Cooperative Extension is a partnership between Virginia Tech, Virginia State University, and the localities. Our mission basically is to get research-based information out to the public. Here in the Prince William office, we have programming in parenting education, financial education, nutrition education, 4-H youth development, and in environmental and natural resources. So we do have some other cover crop videos that are on our YouTube page. Some of you may have been here in May when we did a short class on cover crops in the landscape in general. You can find that on YouTube. When I talk about cover crops, a lot of people will ask what exactly are cover crops. And basically it's any crop that you're using to cover the soil when it otherwise would be bare. And there are what agriculture considers traditional cover crops, but there are a lot of things, especially in the home garden, that you can use as a cover crop. Cover crops aren't necessarily harvested. Sometimes they are, depending on what we're using them for. And cover crops generally aren't fertilized. Basically, we have cover crops there to do a number of jobs. The reason we want cover crops is because they act as an armor to protect the soil. They act as a reservoir for nutrients. In some cases, they'll add nutrients. In some cases, they will concentrate nutrients into the root zone, pulling it up from other parts of the soil layers. Some cover crops will help us suppress pests. All cover crops will help us improve the soil structure. Cover crops will also help insulate the soil, and it will keep our microbes, our beneficial microbes, more active throughout the year. And so where exactly do cover crops fit into our gardening? Well, they fit into the soil ecosystem, and soil really is just not dirt. It's a whole community. It's a very complex community. And really what we use cover crops for is to pull solar energy and get that energy into the system. And that involves a micro herd of microscopic organisms, many of whom form beneficial relationships with our plants. A not so micro herd in the soil, which can range anywhere from small mammals to insects, arthropods, mollusks. Got plant roots, and the living plant root is really important to help drive that system. It's estimated that anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the carbohydrates that a plant produces in a healthy ecosystem, it gives away to the microbes in the soil. And it does that because it gets benefits. Microbes will help bring nutrients. Microbes will help with soil structure. In some cases, microbes will help with bringing, I guess you would call them enzymes that will help the plants fight off pests. And the other thing, again, cover crops are going to help the system working year round. Instead of shutting down in winter and everything kind of going dormant and having to jump start itself in the spring, having cover crops over the winter will allow that system to continually function, and so the startup time in the spring is much less. For many of us, we're stuck with really bad soil. Those of us who are in urban, suburban settings, we typically, if we look at the space that we have, we've got compacted soil, heavily compacted soil, not a lot of organic matter. very little active life in the soil. And it's a system that favors anaerobic conditions, and anaerobic conditions are where a lot of the things we don't want in the soil tend to thrive. And the other problem with the heavily compacted soils is that most of the water will run off and not into the soil, and it won't be there for our plants to take up in times of drought. And so we've got a couple graphs there that show generally the range of what we see in urban, suburban soils. In really extreme cases, there's very little pore space, only about 2%, which is broken down into a little bit of room for water and a little bit of room for air. In other cases, we'll see about 20% pore space. Again, a little more room for water, a little more room for air and root growth, but it's still not an ideal area to be growing plants in. And you can think of this as a brick. It's basically like growing a cheetah pet. You know, there's not a whole lot of anything for those chia seeds to draw on, and if it's not watered regularly, the plants suffer. What we want is more of a 50-50 pore space versus solids. And in this situation, we've got a very sponge-like soil with lots of room for water, for air, for roots. And to get a soil like this, we need higher amounts of organic matter, because that's going to help drive that ecosystem in the soil. And cover crops are an important way to use this biological activity to turn that brick into soil. And so when we're talking about building soil, going from the brick to the sponge, we basically want to look at 4 things: reducing disturbance, mixing plant species, covering the soil, maximizing living roots. And it's these last 3 where cover crops can do the most good in your garden. So this soil is the parent material for this bed. A year ago in October, we made these beds and we amended it with compost, and we've had cover crops in ever since. And you can see the old parent material is pretty compacted. It's really wet, relatively speaking. Here, this new bed, really rich in organic matter. You can see the living roots from the cover crop, even more so than this permanent turf that's been there. Oops. This turf has been there for decades, and it doesn't have a lot of root mass. This cover crop that we're turning under has all kinds of root mass, really rich in organic matter, and will make a beautiful growing medium for our next crop. Cover crops have the advantage of taking solar energy and putting them into the garden all year round. They're going to be converting that solar energy into carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates are going to be there to support the biology. And even in the dead of winter, a lot of times the plant may look dormant, but it's actually putting things in the ground into its root system. It may not grow very tall, but it's still actively growing. And cover crops are going to help support that ecosystem. That ecosystem is going to help build the soil, break up that clay, and it's going to protect nutrients from leaching away or washing away. And depending on what cover crops you use, it can also be adding nutrients into the soil. So here's an example of a crimson clover cereal rye mix. It's February, there's frost on the ground. It looks like it's not doing much, but by the end of the day, that frost is burned off. All the while, that cereal rye in particular, crimson clover is still small and it's protected underneath that rye. It's pulling in carbohydrates. It's adding those carbohydrates into the soil and feeding those microbes, building the soil. So some basics. If you've never used cover crops, you probably want to start simple. Any crop really can be a cover crop. It's easier if you're a beginner to just start with a single species, but You can mix species, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Different plant families bring different things to the party. Legumes, for example, will add more nitrogen, especially when they're in the ground with grasses. Grasses will hold on to nutrients that have been left over from the previous crop so they don't leach away. A lot of times our brassicas are good at pulling things from deep in the soil, and they're also really good about breaking up compacted soil. When you use multiple species, you're feeding the system throughout the soil profile. The advantage of mixing your cover crops is that you're feeding throughout that profile and you get a more diverse and a more balanced ecosystem. The problem with using multiple species is the more species you add, less of a science it becomes, more of an art it becomes. It's a little bit tricky in terms of when you plant. The more things you have in the mix, some things can dominate, and some of the plants that you put in the mix may not actually do the job that you want them to do because they've been outcompeted by other things. So here we're looking at one of the things that cover crops can do for us. We have this sun hemp over here, and the sun hemp is a summer cover crop, and we're using this to build nitrogen into the bed. And so right after a storm, we decided it's probably a good time to take it down. When we pulled up the roots just to see what was going on one plant, all of these little nodules here, those are basically just pockets of nitrogen. And so legumes are really good to plant before a crop that really needs a lot of nitrogen, like tomatoes or corn. So if we look at some of the cool season crops that typically get used, they don't necessarily always get used in a garden situation. These are things that we typically see, at least in agriculture. Some of our grains like barley and cereal rye and oats, wheat would be included in that. Typically, we'll see some legumes like crimson clover, various vetches, winter peas are another example. And then brassicas, typically daikon radishes, but there are other brassicas you can use. And when we think about cover crops, we have to think about, well, what job do we want them to do? And so, for example, our grains are going to be scavenging nitrogen from the previous crop so they don't leach away. Our vetches and clovers are going to be adding nitrogen for the next crop. And our brassicas, generally speaking, are going to be breaking up clay, and they're also going to be pulling nutrients from deeper in the soil. We also have to consider what some of the particularities are for some of these crops. Some of them will kill in the winter, and we have to think about, will that work with our plan, or is that okay? Some of them can be planted in a very wide window. Others need to be planted in a very narrow window to make sure they're mature enough to survive the winter. Some of them produce high biomass, some of them produce low biomass. And so from a gardening perspective, some of these crops aren't necessarily easy to get, but what other things might you use in the garden that will survive the winter that will act as a cover crop? Pansies have been used, different types of peas that can use, although peas sometimes can winter kill. Annual ryegrass, which is a turf rather than a cereal grain. Annual ryegrass is a little bit tricky because if you don't kill it early enough, it can get weedy. You can use garlic. You can use turnips. You can use catgrass. What they sell as catgrass is actually wheat, and it makes a very good cover crop. So if you think about, doing things simple, if you need a lot to happen, if you need to break up clay, but you still need to add nitrogen, you can mix 2 or 3 cover crops fairly easily without it getting too complicated. And basically it's mixing and matching from these different columns here and coming up with something that's going to work for you. A lot of times, for example, in our demonstration garden, we use cereal rye, crimson clover, and maybe daikon radishes. In other cases, we might use wheat in one of the vetches, or rye in one of the vetches. It really kind of depends on what you're looking for. Number of brassicas that are good for breaking up soil and pulling things from deep in the soil profile. Canola, which is sometimes sold as rapeseed, mustards, bok choy, turnips, daikon radishes. All of those can be temperature sensitive, particularly if you're farther north, but they do have value, especially if they're planted early enough to help build the soil and get those microbes working for you. So some examples here, we've got cereal rye, crimson clover, daikon radish, which is sometimes called a tillage radish or a forage radish. As you can see, it's a thick, long radish. Vetch. Now with vetch, you have to be careful. Hairy vetch and common vetch, good choices. Crown vetch, however, is really, really invasive, so you want to stay away from crown vetch. Down here, we've got buckwheat. Buckwheat is an interesting cover crop because even though it's more of a cool season plant, we tend to use it in the summer because it cycles really quickly from seed to flower and dropping seed, and sometimes it's a good placeholder as we move from crop to crop. Over here, we've got a 7-way mix. This is a good example of when you add a lot of things, it becoming more of an art than a science. In this particular case, mostly what you can see are daikon radishes, and that's because when we planted it in September, the weather conditions were such that it favored the daikon radish, and the daikon radish basically dominated everything. And our 7-way mix actually ended up being more of a daikon radish with a few other things thrown in here and there. Over here, we've got a mix of crimson and red clover. Not sure why red clover is actually called red clover because it's purple. Crimson is this nice red, long spikes. Bees really like crimson clover in the spring. Here we've got a simple 3-way mix of crimson clover, here, daikon radish, and hairy vetch. And then over here, we've got an area that the mix of dill and daikon radish. Dill is there as a benefit to attract beneficials as the summer progresses and acted as a nurse crop for the daikons. The daikons will eventually overpower it as it gets into fall. So again, there's some warm season cover crops, and we won't talk about those too much today because we're getting in the season where we're using winter ones more often. We don't tend to use a lot of summer cover crops just because most of the time that's when those vegetables we really want are growing. It's good if you've got a bed that you just started and you want to get it up and running. And again, buckwheat is very handy because it can pull up phosphorus from deep in the soil. It can help hold on to nitrogen. It's very pollinator friendly, and it's about 30 days between the time you plant it and the time it's ready to drop seed again. So if you've got a small window between crops, buckwheat is an awesome thing to add to your garden. So some examples, these beds were put into summer cover crops. Over here, we've got sun hemp on the left, got some cut flowers there in the middle, and then we've got sorghum. And you can see it looks a lot like corn because it's in that same family. Here we have a cover crop of cut flowers. Again, anything can be a cover crop. And with a home gardener, a lot of times some of the more traditional cover crops may not be as readily available. And so you have to improvise sometimes. So we have sunflowers here. Sometimes we'll use sunflowers as a cover crop. Typically, we don't really harvest sunflowers for the seed, but sometimes we will. If you're looking for a long season cover crop in the summer, sunflowers make an excellent choice. They're easy to get, and they add a lot of beauty to your garden. And then sometimes you have to think about, some of our cover crops need to reach a certain level of maturity before able to be winter hardy. Crimson clover is a good example of this. In Northern Virginia, we're kind of at the northern edge of where crimson clover will survive the winter, but it's got to get up to a certain height, certain level of maturity in order for that to happen. And so in this particular picture, we've got sunflowers, but before we've harvested the sunflowers, we've got enough light coming in that our cereal rye and crimson clover can start coming up. And this will get the crimson clover up to a healthy size where it can survive the winter. The one question I get asked a lot about cover crops, it's like, okay, I see the value in it, but what do I do with it? And there are different ways to deal with our cover crops when it comes to the spring. And some of them you can wait till maturity and then treat them like any other crop. But a lot of times we don't have that time, especially in a home garden situation. And so the old traditional way is to turn them under. And basically you're killing the cover crop by uprooting it and burying it back in the soil. Because of the balance of nitrogen and carbon and what the biology in the soil needs, typically we wait 2 weeks to replant just so the nitrogen carbon balance can readjust. The downside is we have the possibility of bringing weed seeds to the surface. Anywhere you go, there are lots of weed seeds on the soil. They get blown in, they get dropped in. A lot of times they get buried, but once we expose them, there's a chance they're going to germinate. So that's a disadvantage here. The other disadvantage, of course, is that you're creating soil disturbance, and that, while sometimes it's necessary, is not the best thing for your soil health. The other things that turning under does, it moves those residues to the subsurface, there's less oxygen, and so they will break down slower than if they were on the surface. And again, it doesn't minimize tillage when you're turning under, which is one of those things we want to do to help build our soil, but sometimes it is a necessary thing to have to do. And so with pictures here, hand turning of vetch, and on the bottom we're rototilling rye. Now another option you have is mowing. Whether or not this will actually kill the cover crop depends on the stage of growth. Nice thing about mowing is a lot of times you can leave the residue right where it is, or you can take it away and dry it for straw and use it later. With immature plants, if we want to kill those, we have to mow them and then cover them with plastic. Crimping is another option, and crimping basically is breaking the vascular tissue. Plant has to be at a certain stage of maturity. Typically, it's not quite fully mature, but just close to it, and it only works with certain crops. It's really easy with our cereal grains. It's a little more challenging with our legumes. And here we have 3 examples of crimping going on. Basically broken the vascular tissue here and just laid it down. The nice thing about this is that you can pull that, in this case rye, away and plant starts directly into it. And you've got a perfect mulch, and the nutrients from that rye are going to sink into the soil and be there for that tomato. So this is an example of cutting and covering. Here we've got rye. This was going to be a brassica bed, if I'm remembering correctly. So we're in really early spring, don't have time for it to get to maturity. So we cut it, cover it, and that's going to kill that rye there, so we can plant. And so this video is showing the similar matter where we covered that rye. You can see after a week, everything's pretty much dead. There was a fennel plant in there, and the fennel plant has a much stronger root system. So we're cutting that down again. But that's ready to plant, basically. We'd add some compost, put our starts in, and we're ready to go. On this video on the right shows an example of crimping. We've got all of that rye over there that's in fairly mature stage. And so what we're doing, and you can see one of our master gardeners down there, crimping it over, breaking that vascular tissue. And this is really effective with our grains. Like I say, it's a little harder with our legumes to do it that way. In this case, the legumes, it's easier just to cut them at that mature stage and they won't regrow. But these are 2 examples of how you would deal with your cover crops in your garden. Now, one other thing that can happen is winter kill. And some of our cover crops we plant knowing that they're going to die. Daikon radish is an excellent example of that. Daikon radish we're going to plant late summer, early fall. We want to let it get big, lots of top growth. And then when it freezes, it's going to kill that plant. And all that top growth is going to drop down and act as a mat. It's a weed barrier. In the meantime, the taproot that it's created has gone into the soil, broken up some of that clay. It's pulled nutrients up. And you can see from this picture in the lower right, this is late March. This has been winter killed. This is a top residue that's still kind of deteriorating. This is what the root looks like deteriorating. I don't have a picture of it in April, but in April you couldn't tell that that root was there at all. It had amalgamated into the soil. The thing about using winter kill is that depending on how the winter goes, sometimes things that are supposed to winter kill don't. And sometimes things that aren't supposed to winter kill do. And so it's really important that you understand where you are as far as temperate zones and understand what temperatures some of these plants need in order to survive the winter. If things die when you're not expecting that, that's a problem. If this daikon radish, we let it grow and we have a really mild winter and it doesn't freeze kill, then we got to think about what we're going to do to take it out in the spring. A lot of times it's just a matter of pulling. Daikons are easy for that. We also don't want to lose those nutrients, and we want to think about how we're going to reincorporate that in the garden soil. So here we have an example of another summer cover crop, and in this case it's sorghum, and it had some storm damage, and so we cut it down knowing that it wasn't quite mature enough to kill it. We allowed it to regrow because we wanted to pull more solar energy. We undersowed it with vetch, and so it got frost damage in October. By December, it had freeze killed, but we put the vetch in late, and by leaving that standing cover crop from the summer, what it allowed that to do is insulate the vetch so the vetch could get to a sizable range where we could let it survive the winter. So if you're planting sweet corn, for example, it would be the same sort of thing where in the late part of October, when you're getting your last sweet corn, that's when you would undersow with the vetch, let it go through frost, and that vetch will come out. And you can probably do this with crimson clover just as easily. Crop residues are really important, and a lot of times we want to take them away and make the garden look clean, but those crop residues are very important. They help keep the soil cooler. They help retain moisture. When we have heavy storm events, they can help hold that water in the garden area until it has time to infiltrate. The other thing it can do is it can help protect plants from beating of rain and in some cases hail. It provides a nice habitat for some of our beneficial insects and spiders. And as these things break down, it adds organic matter to the soil. And again, that helps fuel the biology in the soil, making for a healthier soil, a better soil, and then healthier plants. So I've got a number of references here. Our YouTube channel, playlist for soil health and cover crops. There's a publication that we produced using cover crops in the garden. The Iowa Learning Farms cover crops resource page is a little geared more towards agriculture, but it does have some valuable information there. Managing Cover Crops Profitably is a book by the group SAR, which is a sustainable agriculture group that is supported by USDA. This book is available online, or you can buy hard copies of it, but it's available as a PDF. They're into the 3rd edition now. You can download it. It talks a lot about cover crops, and it explains species by species of things that are typically used in cover crops. Again, it's more ag oriented, but it can give you good information that you can use in a practical sense in your garden. And then the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is part of USDA, has a cover crop manual for Virginia. Again, more ag-related, but it's a good reference to have. And you can adapt that to your garden as well. So in summary, we really want to work with nature. We want to build and protect our soil using cover crops. We want to check that soil. We want to nurture that ecosystem. And again, those cover crops are going to invigorate that soil year round. It's a win-win when we use cover crops because we're really maximizing the benefit that we can get out of that soil. We're maximizing solar energy, and we're really helping those microbes. The more that ecosystem is in balance, the healthier that ecosystem is under the ground, the healthier your plants are going to be, and the less fertilizer you're going to need, and the less pesticides you're going to need. With that, I will take questions if there are any.
I am particularly interested in whether cover crops are a viable option for what is essentially container gardening, using 3 6-foot by 2 by 3 tall stock tanks. Thank you.
That's a good question. So the thing with container gardening is that typically with container gardening, we're using soilless media, which is structure, not biology. And so cover crop, legumes might be helpful because you'd be adding nitrogen back into that, but I don't think it would be as useful as having a whole, in-ground system. I think over time, if you use cover crops to build up that biology, then it might be worthwhile, especially in a bigger container like that. For smaller containers like pots, I wouldn't really bother with it. Deep, long stock tank, you could do it. It would just take a lot longer to build up the biology if you started with potting mix. If you started with soil, then there would be benefit as well. If you pulled soil from the earth, you already have that biology in there, and using cover crops is just going to stimulate them and help them.
Brassicas are reported not to form mycorrhizal associations. Is there some other plant that can be used with the brassicas to support the mycorrhizal fungi if using brassicas to break up the clay soil?
So a lot of our cereals would be helpful. While brassicas don't specifically do that with mycorrhizal fungi, they help support a balanced ecosystem, which in turn does support those. So it's more of an indirect. But really, I think that adding cereals, adding legumes do a little bit, but not as much. I think really having cereals with that would work. And the advantage of having a cereal with, say, a daikon is that, especially if the cereal was planted a little earlier, it can get up tall above the daikon so that when the daikon freeze kills and mats down, that cereal is still going to be up high enough where it's still going to be able to pull solar energy in and still keep working.
Okay, good cover to plant in a large area to break down clay and possible lead exposure.
That's two different things entirely. So if you're worried about breaking up clay, really the brassicas are going to do that for you. I would use daikons on a large area. Yeah, we typically see daikons used in farm fields. That's a really good option. In terms of pulling out metals contamination, that's a little trickier. There's not really a whole lot you can do in the winter. Probably the two best plants for pulling out metals are hemp and sunflowers. And of course, hemp, depending on where you are, you may not be able to grow it, or you may need a permit to grow it. But sunflowers are fairly good at pulling up metals. We use those quite a bit in reclaiming mine land. Particularly in the southwest of Virginia, we've used those very successfully. The tricky part is that, okay, I've got sunflowers with lead in them. What do I do with them? I'm not sure what the good answer for that is. I would go ahead and get the soil tested for lead first. Unfortunately, we don't do that at Virginia Tech, but there are a number of commercial labs that do that. A&L Labs, oh, it's not A&L anymore, it's Waypoint. Yeah, Waypoint Labs in Richmond is one of those that does a lot of environmental testing. They can probably hook you up with a lead test if that's a concern.
Can you plant directly into winter-killed cover crops, or must you still wait 2 weeks?
No, by the time you're ready to plant something that's been winter killed in an area where it's been winter killed, any kind of carbon nitrogen balance has been restored. A lot of times it's just poking. For example, I've used daikons in beds where it's just daikons because I've got really bad soil where I am. It's heavily compacted. So they all die down. I then want to put in tomatoes. So, I'm not going to put in tomatoes where I am until about May, end of April. So that cover crop has already died. It's already been flat on the ground for a while. It's not going to be an issue.
Are there any cover crops that do well in part shade? I have an area that gets 5 hours of sun in the afternoon.
It's more of an issue of how much sun they get rather than 5 hours of shade. Typically, our cover crops need at least 6 hours, ideally more if you're talking about our grains. But also keep in mind that, typically our winter cover crops are going to get more sun exposure than we normally think about it because the leaves are going to drop off trees. Unless the shading's from a building or something, or evergreens. But a lot of times too, what does really well in a full sun situation can do okay in a shady situation. And in some cases, that's a good thing. So for example, if you plant cereal rye in August and you let it go, it's going to grow for a while. And then once it gets cold, it's going to stop. And then it's going to start growing again in the spring. Well, if it's in a shady spot, that biomass, the amount of top growth that you get will be significantly less in the shade than it will be in the sun. You're still working the soil, you're just not getting as much top growth, and that might, in some cases, be handy.
I just want to add to the 2 questions about the links into the chat. We'll have this posted on our YouTube channel and our Facebook pages. You can also take a screenshot of your screen right there where his links are. Okay, so next question. So you don't want to harvest peas, daikon, turnips grown as cover crops, just confirming.
A lot of the winter peas that we use as cover crops typically get harvested in a production system as dry peas, as opposed to green, what we usually think of like as snap peas. So you can, in the end, harvest those peas as dry peas for use for soups, for example. Daikons I would not harvest because daikons, when they're relatively young, are tender, but as they get older, they get woodier. And so while they are edible, but not palatable. And what was the other one? Oh, turnips. Turnips, basically, if you have a mild winter, you could probably harvest those turnips. If you have a severe winter, those turnips will probably be dead and will be rotted by the time that you're ready to get them out of the ground. In an ideal situation with a cover crop, you just leave it and all those nutrients go back in the soil. And it could be a case where you're going to harvest some and you're going to leave the rest, depending on the size of your garden and depending on what you end up deciding that's going to work for you.
I have an area that will be turned into a meadow starting in the fall. What sequence would you suggest? I was going to do some seeding in the fall, but what cover crop is useful and what would a
Okay.
cover crop be useful and what?
At this point in the year, if you're going to do a meadow in the fall, well, it actually depends on what you've got now. If it's bare right now, I would use buckwheat or actually if there are annual flowers that you know you want incorporated in your meadow, I'd throw those down if it's bare soil. If it's currently turf, until you kill the turf, I wouldn't put anything down because at least the turf is acting as, you know, a living cover. If this was like early spring and you were going to do a fall meadow, then you might want to consider some cover crops, but probably it's not going to be worth the hassle of using a cover crop at this point.
Could you name some varieties of Austrian winter peas? Don't think I've heard of them before.
I don't think I've actually ever heard of different varieties of Austrian winter peas. Typically you find winter peas, you're not going to find them like at the box stores like Lowe's and Home Depots. You're typically going to find those at like farmers co-ops, like Southern States or Culpeper Co-op in Warrenton. Yeah, I can't really think of any varieties. You also can find them in seed catalogs, particularly some of the organic seed catalogs, places like Southern Exposure, Seed Exchange in Mineral. I believe they have field peas.
Okay, we have two questions about sandy soil.
As to whether cover crop in sandy soil or not? Or
What would be good for sandy soil?
anything. The big problem with sandy soil is that sandy soil drains really well. In an ideal situation, sandy soil is going to drain really well. It doesn't have the problem of compaction, but it also has the problem of it tends not to have as many nutrients. And so keeping the ground covered is really important because as you're building up that organic matter in the soil, that's helping the sandy soil be more resilient and have more nutrition in the soil for the plants, if that makes sense.
Can you use peanuts as a cover crop?
Yes, with caution. So peanuts, if you're going to use peanuts as a cover crop, you would have to use them in the summer. If you're not familiar with growing peanuts, peanuts are a long-growing legume, which means they're going to add nitrogen to the soil. Peanuts basically get about shrub size if they have enough space to grow, and they're actually quite an attractive plant. The problem with using peanuts is sometimes, depending on where you get your peanuts from, you need to use a reputable source, otherwise you could introduce disease. That said, peanuts are a great way to add nitrogen, and it's an attractive way to add nitrogen. Peanuts are one of those things too that you can plant peanuts in your front yard, not in the turf, because obviously they'll get bigger than the turf, but in your garden beds in the front, and your HOA is not going to think that they're a vegetable crop. It's going to think that it's just a nice small shrub. But peanuts can be used. The big problem is that it takes all summer for them to grow.
Do you need to clear the ground to plant the cover crops like daikon, or is it strong enough to be planted among the current wild plants?
And well, it depends on what those current wild plants are. If you're talking about, well, okay, I've got turf and I want to convert this into a vegetable garden, I wouldn't overseed into turf. There are other ways to manage that. If you've got turf that's got bare areas, especially, and it's compacted, and your HOA isn't going to freak out about it, you could use daikons to break those up. But again, if you're trying to reclaim an area for a garden, you're probably better off doing what's referred to as sheet mulching, which is laying cardboard down, and then several alternating layers of brown and green materials, covering that with compost. And then probably you could either put a cover crop into that, or you could just cover it with mulch and wait until the next season, and then you should be ready to plant into it. So if we go back for a minute, so these beds here, the reason that they're in summer cover crop is because the fall before we had done that sheet mulching, we had covered them with, trying to remember, some of them we covered with cereal rye and some of them we just covered with mulch. But we wanted to build that soil before we planted a true vegetable crop in it. And that's why we put the sorghum in there. But if you sheet mulch in the fall, you'll be ready to plant in that area in the spring if you really need to.
How about sweet peas?
I don't remember at what temperature sweet peas die. You'd have to check and see how winter hardy they are. Theoretically, yes, they can be used as cover crop, particularly in the fall or in the spring.
What happens if I didn't follow the management termination of my cover crop?
So it depends. Famous extension expression. It really depends on what the cover crop is. So if we think about our winter cover crops, let's see. So here we have daikon, for example. If this doesn't get winter killed, what's going to happen is that this top growth here is going to grow and grow and grow. And probably what will happen before it goes to seed is that you'll get harlequin bugs. And so it can make an excellent trap crop for harlequin bugs. But eventually this will go to seed. It'll put out flower, put out seed pods, and you can get daikon seeds from that. If we're talking about cereals, typically our cereals are going to get tall and you're going to get seed heads. You could theoretically harvest the grain. I will tell you that it takes an awful lot of grain to make a pound of flour, so it may not be worth it to do that. But, you could let those go until they reach the end of their life stage, and then you would just cut them as straw. Now, if we're talking about some of our legumes, so this is crimson clover. Up here in the upper right, we've got the crimson and the red clover mixed together. Crimson clover, so up here, when crimson clover looks all red like that all the way down, that's the peak of bloom. Here we have crimson clover is starting to fade and seeds going to be formed. Sometimes crimson clover will survive the summer. Sometimes it will just die off. Most of the time, I've let crimson clover go pretty late into the spring, largely because I want it for the pollinators. I've never let it just go, so I'm not sure exactly how that would work. But eventually it's going to die because crimson's an annual. And so it's a matter of then it'll reach the end of its life stage and you'll just have to cut it. The tricky one is vetch. I've never let vetch go long enough where it's just died out. And I've let vetch go pretty long into the summer sometimes. Vetch is probably one you really want to be cautious about letting go. That you definitely want to mow it after it flowers. But it really depends on what cover you're using as to how best to deal with it if you let it go to the end. In most cases, it's simply going to be, it's reached the end of its life cycle, just cut it.
Are oats a good cover crop?
It depends on where you are. In Northern Virginia, most years oats will winter kill, which again isn't necessarily a bad thing. In Southern Virginia, that probably will survive the winter. Farther north, they're more likely to winter kill. But we have used oats in our teaching garden. think one of the reasons why we stopped using oats is because there for a while we could only get them in 50-pound bags, and that was way more oats than we needed.
This is a good question. Is there a difference in using white clover and red clover?
Yes, there's a difference between using white clover, red clover, and crimson clover. So crimson clover is an annual. It's the red spiky one. Red clover is the one with the actual purple ball-shaped flowers. Red clover is a short-lived perennial, and so typically you're looking at about 5 years is the lifespan of a red clover. White clover is our long-lasting perennial. White clover, you know, you put white clover in, it's gonna, once it establishes, it's gonna be really hard to kill. Red clover and white clover, typically we only use as a cover crop in situations where we know that soil is otherwise not going to be used. So for example, a lot of times in orchards, in the lanes between the trees, they'll put down a perennial clover because it'll be there long term. If you're talking about using a clover as a cover crop in a home garden situation, crimson clover is your best option. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. And if you have comments, other questions, please let us know. Our email is mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Thank you all for coming and have a good rest of your week.